Violence. It's to be expected in video games, especially ones named Assassin's Creed. But not all murder in these games are of the stealth variety. A lot, if not most, of your bloodshed will come in the form of hand-to-hand combat, aerial combat, ship combat. Basically, there's a lot of ways to kill people in these games. So let's talk about them. Today I'm going to give you my ranking of the combat in Assassin's Creed. Keep in mind that this is only a ranking of combat, and a low ranking in this regard does not mean a low ranking of that game in general. A great game can have terrible combat, and vice versa. This is your disclaimer to just be civil. If you like this video, be sure to do so, and subscribe for future rankings. Coming in at 12, and the worst combat in Assassin's Creed, is Assassin's Creed Syndicate. Jumping from the French Revolution to the Industrial one, Assassin's Creed decided to revolutionize their combat once again. Assassin's Creed Syndicate is the most modern game in the series. Set in Victorian London, it had to make noticeable changes to its combat system in order to work. While Unity focused on weight and realism, Syndicate focused on speed. Speed is the only thing I can say about this combat system. There are only 3 buttons: attack, parry, and break defense. The game prompts you when to use them, and almost every enemy type can be killed with one of them. The weapon types are vast, but they are all the same. There is no meaningful difference between the way the two characters fight either, as everyone is just running at 100 miles an hour. The game put a heavy focus into combos. Combo hits that kept a tally as you beat your opponent to a blistering pulp. Sometimes it took as many as 15 to 20 slices to kill them. Is there anything less assassin-like than stabbing someone 27 times with a letter opener? Syndicate is a Looney Tunes style combat approach that is honestly more laughable than enjoyable. At no point playing this game did I feel the assassin fantasy. At least Black Flag gave me a 10 out of 10 pirate fantasy. I feel there are better ways to give me a Victorian thug fantasy, but I honestly never really wanted that in the first place. There was also a focus on finisher combos. Just like in Unity, you didn't have to finish someone off right away, but unlike Unity, they wouldn't eventually die. In Syndicate, you can leave opponents in a stupor once they reach low health, line up as many as 4 of them in a row, and watch your protagonist perform a killer move. Just like in Unity, however, there are no other forms of combat outside of melee or shooting. We also cannot defend against gunshots other than, wailing away at them, which seems to do the trick. The special moves unlocked by the skill tree aren't actually moves, they are better called effects. The same move still applies, but they give you different outcomes in different scenarios. But Syndicate is the easiest combat system in Assassin's Creed, easier than Black Flag, but with none of the selling points. There really isn't a way to make the game harder, because you have to level up to be able to function in the game, but you have to access the skill tree to level up. The guard types provide no challenge, and you can literally win every single brawl by just holding the counter button. Overall, this leaves Syndicate with the least fleshed out form of combat in the entire series, less than that of Assassin's Creed 1 released a decade prior. While Syndicate makes a lot of changes, literally every change it made was for the worse. Coming off the back of Unity, it dumbed down the combat, sped it up, removed the challenge, the feel, and the variety, and the general sense of accomplishment of learning the game. Being innovative is not just about change, it is about making a positive one, and Syndicate failed at this miserably. The only good thing I can say is I'm glad that we only got one game like this. In terms of story and setting, Syndicate did a terrific job. The setting was matched perfectly. They had removed large weapon types as those could not be carried around Victorian London. This meant they had to make the combat faster. They had to revolutionize it, and they truly did the best they could with what they had. The problem wasn't poor design, it was just the setting. Placing an AC game in Victorian London just doesn't allow you the freedom of past games. In terms of story, the slapstick-style sitcom tone of the narrative honestly fits the overly cartoonish combat. AC Syndicate's tone was very consistent throughout. It is just unfortunate the tone that they chose. The only thing it has going for it was how well it fit the story and the setting, but the slapstick quality, the ridiculousness, and the total lack of variety leaves it at the bottom of this list.
The key to the waltz is one must lead with one's right foot.
At 11, we have Assassin's Creed Odyssey. For the first time in half a decade, Ubisoft didn't completely scrap its last combat system and replace it with a new one. Odyssey brought back Origin's system and added a few tweaks of its own. The weapon types are mostly the same, but now every single weapon in the game is unique. No two are exactly the same, so you now have more customization than ever. However, gone are the bow types, and instead there are unlockable abilities that simulate what the other bows did in Origins. This makes it easier to focus on getting a bow that has the best stats, but gives you a little less customization over your character build. However, gear comes back and there is a lot of it. In fact, you spend more time managing your inventory than you do actually fighting, which is a major drag. But for players who want a total experience, this is a massive one. The skill tree is expanded to include some rather amazing and quite impossible moves. This gives an insane amount of variety to the combat of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, whether you like it or not. The naval battles return and are almost as impressive as Black Flag, but due to the time period it is set in, it doesn't offer as much variety of shot types, and if boss fights were your thing in Origins, they are everywhere in Odyssey. Legendary animals, Isu creatures, and the Cult of Cosmos. There is even a Shadow of Mordor-style mercenary system, as bounty hunters will track you down. However, there is no shield nor hidden blade. One of these is super important. I'll let you decide which. In both of their places we have the Spear of Leonidas, and this spear explains everything about the fantastical aesthetic of combat. Think Syndicate, but with larger weapons. It is one thing to stab a guy 47 times with a fingernail file and him still be wobbling around. It's another to chop him with an axe multiple times and have him show no signs of damage at all. The sheer amount of damage enemies can take makes the feeling of this game as comical as Syndicate, if not more so, but for all the wrong reasons. Not to mention all of the ridiculous things Cassandra or Alexios can do physically. At least Origins drew the line somewhere, even though it was already pushing it. If Origins towed the line, there is no reason why an Assassin's Creed game should have magical abilities. I shouldn't have poisonous or flaming blades. I shouldn't be able to turn invisible. I shouldn't be able to send massive grown men completely airborne by kicking them. I don't care if Cassandra is a demigod. I don't care what the reason is. It not only destroys the assassin fantasy, it destroys the basic premise of the game. It destroys every fan's expectation, and not in a clever way. The total bastardization of combat is the crux of the bastardization of the story. What did Odyssey actually create? Anything it did well, it owes Origins, and anything it did poorly, it can only blame itself. It didn't even invent the naval combat, as Black Flag perfected that 5 years prior, and this version is objectively worse. The boss fights don't get more technical, they just get more tedious. Almost all of them are tests of patience and endurance rather than skill and power. Avoid their attacks for longer than they can absorb yours. The worst part is there is level scaling, so you don't even get to feel like your leveling up means anything. It is a necessity, not a feature. It is a difficult game at times, but how it handles its difficulty is total garbage. I ranked it higher than Syndicate solely because if you ignore the fact that it is an Assassin's Creed game, it can be fun for a while. However, the damage absorbing enemies and the fantastical elements keep it from holding that entertainment for long. Number 10 on this list is Assassin's Creed Rogue. Anything I could say about Assassin's Creed Black Flag, I could probably say about Rogue, at least in terms of variety. The naval combat, the hunting, the swordplay, the shooting, the rope darts, all of the other darts. It even introduces a grenade system that was honestly more clunky than efficient. Even the loss of weapon types still plagued this game as well. At the risk of just repeating myself, I'll leave it there. But this game did introduce one really cool new feature. Shay becomes a Templar. which means our enemies are the assassins, and assassins, well, this means that for the first time, except for a few random encounters and revelations, you had to worry about being assassinated. The game warns you with a white fog as you approach the assassin's area, and the whispers fill your ears. As long as you counter when they attack, you are fine, but it is an interesting reversal. Along with this, we were not the only ship that could board. If you get rammed, prepare to be boarded. It functions just like boarding other ships, except this time they come for you. The Templar flip brought some new twists like I just mentioned, but that is it. Every single bit of action in this game feels like Black Flag. In fact, this game as a whole feels like Black Flag reskinned with an Assassin's Creed 3 filter, ultimately leaving me lacking the innovation of either. But in terms of aesthetics, Assassin's Creed Rogue is a very pretty game. It fulfills much of what Black Flag did and more, but you always get the feeling like something is missing. Is it the heart or is it the soul? For me, it's the pirates. Black Flag's aesthetic was pirate, and Rogue copies this, but instead makes you a privateer. That's cool, but the boarding of ships, the collecting of treasure, all the pirate stuff feels out of place in the North Atlantic. Shay is much larger and should feel heavier than Edward, but they move almost identically. Shay should have had a Connor-like movement system. All of this hurts the story, it doesn't fit the setting, and most of all, it harms the overall aesthetic. Literally nothing changed between Black Flag and Rogue in terms of difficulty. The enemy types are the same. The ship battles are even easier, and none of the new features ever added in any more sense of fear. If Black Flag was one of the easiest games in the franchise, then Rogue might be the easiest. If you are looking for an Assassin's Creed game to just run around, fight some Templar guards, and shoot some ships, you would be better off playing Black Flag. It does everything Rogue did and probably did it better. Plus, it comes with a better story, setting, and overall experience than its successor. But hey, at least Rogue gets to say it finished in the top 10. So coming in at 9, we have easily my most controversial placing, and that is Assassin's Creed 2. If AC1 sprays you with nostalgia, then Assassin's Creed 2 bathes you in it. I don't know if there is any other game in any other franchise that can inspire a fanbase like this game can. But how well does that combat hold up once the nostalgic layer has been removed? Naturally, it borrows almost everything from its predecessor: attack, block, dodge, throwing knives, and of course, the counter kill. However, things like the heavy attack are blocked off and can only be learned by visiting the training ring in the Via. Added in is the ability to grab the smaller enemies and slit their throat for a really brutal kill. If any enemy, and I mean any enemy, is caught with their back to you, you can pierce him for an instant kill. The weapon types are expanded. There are now maces, knives, daggers, and metal knuckles. You can grab fallen weapons and use them as your own, and the double hidden blades allow you to use them in combat more efficiently. Upgradable armor now expands the health of Ezio, and to keep track of our health, he requires medicine. The armor damages over time, so you have to keep it in good condition. The various weapon types also come with stats, but I never really felt like there was much difference between the better graded weapons and the worse. We get a gun towards the end of the game that has a little bit of a functionality issue, but gives us a little risk-reward balance as the Venetian guards cannot be killed by one throwing knife. Do we choose speed or silence? There is a greater level of separation of guard types, each requiring a slightly different strategy to kill, but once you've figured it out, it is nothing but going through the motions. All in all, the game expands on the variety of Assassin's Creed 1 to make the combat something the player enjoys rather than tolerates, but it is far from an enticing feature for the game. Aesthetically, it borrows almost everything from the first game and doesn't provide much else. There are a few more animations for the throat slitting or the backstabbing, but it still doesn't provide the player enough to get excited about. The graphics are slightly upgraded, but this is minuscule given the age of the game in general, as it is still closer visually to AC1 than Brotherhood. The difficulty of Assassin's Creed 2 is somewhat hard to nail down. On the one hand, every upgrade to the combat made it easier. However, all of the newfound ease can be avoided if the player chooses. You don't have to use the new armor. You don't have to use the better weapons. You can use the basic sets, which actually does give the player a struggle in the later games. The counter kill timing window on the hidden blades is significantly smaller, but it is a guaranteed instant kill no matter the enemy type. This brings a risk-reward decision into play. Play it safe with the sword or aggressive with the hidden blades. This, combined with the lack of upgraded armor, gives you a legitimate challenge. Without a difficulty setting, this is the closest you can get to a struggle in Assassin's Creed 2. In terms of story and setting, I think this will be one of my more controversial takes. Just like AC1, the combat is not time-specific, and does not gain or lose points for this. However, from the story perspective, Assassin's Creed 2's combat structure struggles to match the narrative. Ezio begins as a boy, and the first time he ever picks up a sword, he immediately kills 2 well-trained guards with no issue. Then, 2 more. You are told your combat needs to improve by Mario, but you have already taken out every guard you have encountered with ease. The game slowly drips in new combat moves, but just like its predecessor, these don't nearly have the punching power as the moves introduced at the beginning of the game. You can counter kill from the get-go, even before Ezio has learned them. There really isn't a consistency to this, and it hurts your ability to really feel Ezio's struggle. Ezio is just too good right away, and this also affects the believability of his growth. Ultimately, what holds this game back from a combat standpoint is it doesn't excel in any one part, but it has a lot of quality. A jack of all trades, but a master of none. Just above it at 8, we have the original Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed the First. It definitely brings back memories. Some are overly critical of this game. Others view it with far too much nostalgia. For me, I look back on it as what it was. The game that created the template for the entire franchise. Being the origins of the series comes with its perks, but it doesn't come without its drawbacks, and this definitely applies to its combat. It is built around a basic attack, dodge, and parry system that is taught very early on in the game. This is expanded on with a combo attack, a heavy attack, grabbing, and throwing knives. This gives us some variety, just enough to keep it interesting, but not enough to encourage the player to engage in a high dose of combat. But then, the counter kill is introduced. Quickly, this becomes the most useful and many times the only useful attack in the game. Realizing this, Ubisoft decreases the likelihood of an instant kill as you reach harder sections of the map, but the basic combat formula doesn't really change. The enemy types don't vary much as there are easy enemies, harder enemies, and slightly harder enemies. The only real difference is how many attacks it takes to kill them, not necessarily what kinds of attacks you need to use. Altair comes with a sword, a knife, and a hidden blade. Each one provides a different speed and style to combat, but none really favoring over the other. The lack of weapon upgrades or types does become a bit monotonous, especially after the counter kill has been introduced. There is no armor in the game, as health durability is determined more by story completion rather than upgrading your player. All in all, the variety of Assassin's Creed is rather lacking, but this is a good thing for the first installment of a franchise. Aesthetically, Assassin's Creed is as bland as it is basic. You fight from a high-angle shot, and then occasionally zoom in for a finisher, but there are only a few different animations that you've seen a dozen times by the halfway point. The actual sword combat is rather forgettable, as you spend a lot of time striking their blocks or standing to counter. This game does quench the assassin fantasy thirst, but not in terms of combat, as other aspects of this game received the developer's focus and combat was only a formality. It was also limited by the age of the engine it was designed on, but unfortunately, I can't use that as an excuse. As far as innovation goes, AC1 is no doubt the most innovative in the entire franchise. How could it not be? It literally built the basics of the combat system that would be used for a decade going forward. The reality is, in comparison to other AC games, it is actually somewhat difficult. The guards can't always be easily countered. In fact, if you just spam the attack buttons, they will counterattack you. It forces you to actually pick a strategy even if the amount of strategies are limited. However, because the health system is based on story completion, by the halfway point of the game, your health bar is too large to actually give you any pause in fighting a guard, and the most terrifying thing in the game is accidentally landing in water. In terms of setting, There really is nothing special about the combat system that places it in the Third Crusade. Ubisoft uses a mostly copy and paste version of this system in Renaissance Italy, which is aesthetically very different. However, nothing about this game breaks any historical or Assassin's Creed lore-based accuracy. The combat is very well intertwined with the story. Altair is a master assassin, so rather than teach him the combat, the game has him teach other assassins the combat, in turn teaching the player. It is a simple reversal, but one that fits the narrative very well. However, the fact that after Altair is stripped of rank, he loses his special abilities until he teaches them does not really fit the story. Earning his weapons back is a cool idea, but why wouldn't he be able to counter and heavy attack from the get-go? Al-Mualim didn't erase his memory, just took away his tools. It suffers from much of what Assassin's Creed 2 did, but being as innovative as it was as the building block of the entire franchise gives it the edge for me. Coming in at 7, we have Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Assassin's Creed Valhalla takes a lot from Odyssey, but it also ignores a lot and makes it its own. Firstly, the Hidden Blade is back, but once again, it isn't used in combat. Instead, we get more Viking-style weapons. Heavily featured are hammers and axes, but spears, daggers, and swords are available. The bow types are back, and so are shields. It does a great job of bringing back aspects of Origins that worked really well. Valhalla also has the most expansive enemy types in the entire series, and sometimes it feels like every single encounter is a bit different. The boss fights have more variety, including animals, spirits, mythical creatures, beasts, and even main antagonists. In fact, almost every sequence has something of the sort. Even some of the side quests contain unique mini-bosses to take out. If fighting is your game, Valhalla is the AC1 for you. However, ship combat is non-existent, unless you count raids. Raids are the biggest adaptation Valhalla made, and for the most part, they work. You fight alongside your Jomsviking to plunder and pillage, opening treasures, killing various Saxons and Vikings alike. The skill tree is massive, and instead of making huge jumps each level, you get mini levels where your ability slowly grows. It almost feels as this is pointless, but much like real growth, you don't notice it until much later. It can be hard to digest at first, and a lot of the special skills are tucked deep inside so that you have to navigate to get them. The gear itself is a lot less voluminous, so you actually have an incentive to upgrade them. In fact, you should, and often. Raiding gets you more resources. More resources get you better weapons. Better weapons makes it easier to raid. It is a good cycle that can distract you from the story if you want it. Valhalla ultimately takes some of the best parts of Origins and ignores the worst parts of Odyssey to make a very detailed combat system. This game is a massive improvement over Odyssey, but I don't think it truly captures Origins' aura. It doesn't really give me the assassin fantasy, but it definitely fails on the Viking fantasy. It never really knew what it wanted to be. The special moves are a bit more grounded in reality, but still edge the line as Origins did. It owes nearly everything it did well to Origins, and the amount it changed was negligible. Sure, there is more of it, but more is not innovative. Much like Odyssey, I felt this game was too hard in some instances and way too easy in others, with no way to truly calibrate it. This leaves you confused as to why you suck here but not there. Sometimes during raids I could run by all of the fighting and go straight to the chests, without much issue really. But at least the challenge was there, and it didn't hold back the story from trudging along. While I don't think the game lived up to its true Viking fantasy, it did incorporate several aspects of the time period into its combat. Raids, longships, hammers, axes, it checks all of the boxes. However, it, like Odyssey, was held back by the fantastical elements that aren't really explained in a convincing way. The sheer amount of customization and variety of enemies to fight make this a fun experience. It isn't the Assassin's Creed fantasy anymore, nor is it truly the Viking one either, but it is a fun game that gives just enough of everything to be enjoyable. Now in the top half of the list, number 6 is Assassin's Creed Revelations. Assassin's Creed Revelations is essentially the first game to be a total doppelganger for the last. in terms of hand-to-hand combat, almost nothing was changed. The things that were changed were the introduction to the hook blade, which in terms of combat, I only really used in the tutorial and never touched it again, and the new bomb system, which was mostly a stealth component, but I have seen some really interesting combat strategies with it. The biggest addition in terms of combat is actually den defense, which I know is not a form of melee combat, but it is its own combat system and should be included. The enemy types are updated, including the Janissaries, which are quite a bitch to deal with. Aesthetically, this game gives us everything Brotherhood did and more. The kill chain, the assassin recruits, the brutal finishers. The updated animations allow Ezio to really milk some of his kills, which for the most part adds an odd blend of sophisticated brutality to his combat style. However, of all of the things it added, none of them really made an impact, and the impact they did make was not well received. The hook blades, the higher quality animations, these did little to push the franchise forward. The den defense, honestly, might have pushed it backwards. Having Ezio stand back and place assassins in singular spots akin to a mobile strategy game was not only a horrible break from the action, but it was so out of place in an Assassin's Creed game. The only good part about this feature is that other than the tutorial bit in the early game, I never used it. It only becomes an option if your notoriety stays full for too long. The fact that this gameplay sucks so bad made me stay very vigilant about my notoriety at all times. So it did have at least one positive though, not in its gameplay. The kill chain is still there, but we aren't as encouraged to stay unscathed nearly as often. However, the Janissaries are enough of a challenge to offset this. While they function like normal guards, they can't be struck with simple attacks, and they require at least 3 times the damage as a basic guard. They end kill streaks in their path and require you to reset quite often. Almost everything that could apply to Assassin's Creed Brotherhood in terms of how the combat aids the setting and story also applies to Revelation. It didn't have anything about it that was highly specific to the time or place, and from a story perspective, there really is no addition to it by way of combat. If anything, Ezio maintaining his sense of complete dominance, despite being in his 50s, takes away from his story development. If he had slowed down just a little bit, it would be more interesting to see how he copes with not being the most dangerous man in the world. They did this with Altair's sequences as he got older, but he was in his 80s by the time they actually hindered his motions. Similar to Rogue in that it copied most of what its predecessor did, it does everything Brotherhood did well, but sacrifices a lot less than Rogue did compared to Black Flag. But speaking of Brotherhood, it comes in at 5. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood is a fan favorite, and it is the first game to put a heavy focus on combat in terms of story and gameplay. Almost every aspect of Assassin's Creed 2 is copied over into this game with some very important additions. First, in the terms of weapon types, we receive a few more variations, particularly on the heavy side, but also a crossbow which dynamically changes the stealth, though is a liability in combat as it is solely a ranged weapon. The enemy types are essentially the same with a few more styles such as a spear-carrying guard, but the biggest change comes in the form of the kill chain. Unlike in both its predecessors, combat can be strung together into one seamless dance. Instead of focusing on one enemy at a time, we could take out a string of enemies all in one go. After getting your first kill, all you needed to do in order to kill the next was to tap the attack button in their direction and they too would fall. This could go on ad infinitum until you ran out of guards, or they managed to strike you back. So the player must focus on all of the guards at once to ensure they can counter any blow to maintain their streak. Along with this comes the assassin recruits. While we don't control them in hand-to-hand combat, we get to order them as we need. Need a quick assassination of a nearby target? Check. Need a storm of arrows to take out a small battalion? Check. While these changes were small in terms of amount, they completely revolutionized the combat system so that Brotherhood feels miles better than Assassin's Creed 2. Also, Leonardo's war machines give us the first set-piece style combat in the series. We get a tank with both cannon fire and mauling ability, a boat that shoots flaming shots, a carriage with a turret, and a flying machine that drops balls of fire. Not to mention the simple cannons introducing us to these mechanics at the very beginning of the game. Aesthetically though, Is there anything more badass than taking out an entire group of enemies just by waving your hand? Or fighting through an entire army in one continuous go? If what you were looking for in an Assassin's Creed game was to feel totally unstoppable, no game really does this better than Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. They also included more animations, and the use of the gun for finisher moves only adds to the appeal. While every new move only makes the game easier, sometimes fear of death is not the only type of failure in a video game. Brotherhood also introduced optional objectives in its mission types, which to many fans became a frustrating feature in later games. But in Brotherhood, it is incredibly well done and adds a sense of difficulty to the easiest game yet. In several missions, we are not tasked with survival. We are tasked with remaining perfect. To not take any damage in a heavy combat sequence is quite a challenge, as our reflexes must remain impeccable. Knowing that they had made the combat this easy, the wrinkle to challenge the player to remain unscathed adds to the aesthetics, but actually becomes somewhat of a challenge. Of course, the player also has the choice of removing armor and using only the hidden blades to gain the risk-reward factor from Assassin's Creed 2. All of this combined does create a decent challenge, if you choose to play it this way. From a story and setting analysis, nothing about Brotherhood really strikes me as special, nor upsetting. Ezio has become the mentor, so it would make total sense that he is a badass from the get-go. But there is not much of a learning curve through the game, and you are just as deadly at the beginning as you are at the end. This, in my mind, is the first of the great combat systems on the list. It took everything good from the first two games and still managed to innovate the combat for the better. No game in the Ezio trilogy made us feel more like a truly deadly assassin more than Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. The only thing holding it back was the engine it was built on. At 4 we have Assassin's Creed Origins. For the third straight game, Ubisoft switches up the combat. If Unity and Syndicate were revolutions, then Assassin's Creed Origins was a total reconstruction. Gone is the animation-based structure, and in its place is a hitbox-style game that has become increasingly popular. We can still attack, but for the first time our parries come benefit of a shield. This creates a two-handed combat approach that gives the player far more control over the character. We can still dodge and roll, which you will have to do as some of the moves are not blockable, so the only defense is to get out of the way. But it isn't just one shield, by the way. There are several types, each with their own stats and abilities. The same goes for weapon types: swords, daggers, staff, spears, blunt weapons, and of course, the hidden blade, except you can't use it in combat. However, the massive other options mask this fact very quickly. Gone is armored gear, and instead we have an upgrade system. Every part of Bayek's armor needs to be upgraded by hunting and looting for skins and elements, and this even includes the hidden blades. Take that for what it is. It isn't just the gear with special attributes. Bayek himself has them as well. The skill tree has been expanded to learn special moves, several of them customize combat to your liking. This comes in handy as the enemy types are as vast as the desert it's placed in. For the first time ever, you have boss fights. Real boss fights in an Assassin's Creed game. However, a total change from the last several Assassin's Creed is the bow and arrow. We haven't had this in the game since Assassin's Creed 3. There isn't just one type. There are light bows, predator bows, warrior bows, and hunter bows, each provided a different style and purpose. 2 can be equipped at any time, same goes for weapons, switching between them was as easy as ever. The only downside to the combat in my mind is the lack of any alternative forms. Yes, there are ship battles. Kind of. But they are locked into just a couple missions with Aya and are not nearly as fleshed out as Assassin's Creed Black Flag was. Still, this is the first truly customizable combat system for Assassin's Creed. Aesthetically, Origins is a complete change of pace. Sometimes it is unbelievably beautiful to watch Bayek carve through enemies, but the user control can make the visual aspect quite awkward. It doesn't truly fit the assassin fantasy. In fact, it totally destroys it. But it is such a new, fun experience, very few fans truly minded that. However, I don't feel it encapsulated everything it wanted to be, and it didn't really fulfill its promise as an Assassin's Creed combat system. It was the first game since Assassin's Creed 1 to rebuild the combat system from the ground up. When I first played Origins, I died. A lot. I was not expecting something like this from Assassin's Creed, and for the first time, I had to learn how to actually use the combat system properly to move forward in the story. Every boss fight is different, and the enemy types give you an insane challenge, especially if you are underleveled, as it is the first AC game with a difficulty system. This, combined with a level system, gives you both the feeling of being overmatched if you want it, but being a total god if you desire. The combat fit the time period quite well. The shield, the weapon types, the gigantic snake boss fight. To be fair, this entire section was a hallucination. In fact, nothing about the combat is truly unrealistic outside of the total rage and some of the special moves. But it is a video game. Is it as true to the setting as Unity or Syndicate? No. But it doesn't directly cross any egregious lines either. To me, this is about as far as you can take an Assassin's Creed game out of reality and still call it a good fit for the story. Also, Bayek's story is one of aggression, so using the highly developed combat as a focal point for a man hell-bent on fighting every last person who was responsible for the death of his son fits it to a T. While Black Flag excelled at everything but had one huge weakness, Origins had no real weakness. No part of Origins' combat system was bad, and so many aspects were great. If this wasn't an Assassin's Creed game list, then it might be number 1. Coming in at 3, we have Assassin's Creed Black Flag. How could any game involving pirates be considered poor in terms of combat? And this game lives up to that hype in my opinion, and its combat is the main reason for it. The ship battles from AC3 are now more developed than ever. Broadside cannons and swivels make a return. Included are heavy shot, mortars, chain shots, and fire barrels. We can board ships, capture ships, and send them to our fleet, use their parts for scraps, and send their crew where we please. The hunting system is back, but we can now do it in the open water as well. Whales, sharks, and well, more sharks. Hit them with a harpoon, but watch out, they might hit you back. Now our animal kills are used more directly for crafting new gear, and speaking of new gear, I don't know why Ubisoft did this, but where are the weapon types? No daggers, no knives, not even a tomahawk. The only melee weapon you can use is the sword or the hidden blades. And the swords are so deadly, why would you use anything else? Replacing the old weapons or guns. If you craft all of the upgrades, you can hold 4 at a time with 8 bullets, which means good luck. Everything that was good about AC3 is here in 4, at least almost everything. The enemy types are basically copy and paste. While there are less melee weapons, we do receive the rope dart again, along with the sleep darts and berserk darts. They mostly work as stealth, but they are a weapon presented to us all the same. The combat in this game is incredibly intoxicating, and in more ways than one, but the removal of weapon types still confounds me. As a pirate, Edward, being the smallest of assassins, is faster and nimbler in combat. He feels incredibly different than Connor, and this fits the setting and character perfectly. He doesn't need an origin story to understand why he is so good at swordplay. He's a freaking pirate. From a story perspective, he doesn't really need to learn combat, and much of Edward's growth is left to other places. Even with this, the rope darts, the sleep darts, and the berserk darts are introduced organically, and the tutorial section of this game doesn't even feel like one. In terms of difficulty, however, there basically is none. You are Edward fucking Kenway. Do you fear death? Not in the slightest. But unlike Brotherhood, this game doesn't really incentivize you to be perfect. The ship battles become far too easy once the mortar and the heavy shot are utilized, and the forts don't pose a real struggle unless your ship is far too under-equipped. However, you can't unequip them to add a challenge like you could in AC2. Ultimately, Black Flag is the easiest game in the entire franchise, or at least one of them. Had there been any semblance of a challenge, and I have no doubt this game would top the list. I can completely understand why it might top yours. Coming in at 2, our runner-up for the best combat in Assassin's Creed is Assassin's Creed Unity. Assassin's Creed Unity gets very mixed reviews, not just in terms of combat. You either love this game or you hate it, and I can see why. However, the combat is at the crux of this issue. Unlike in Black Flag and Rogue, the emphasis for the developers were in the exact opposite areas, so in many ways, this was a culture shock to many AC fans. First of all, gone are the instant kill counters. This alone drastically changes the game for most players. Instead, the player has to fully engage with their opponent, wither away at their health, and either let him bleed out or deliver a finishing blow. It is still an attack, parry, dodge, and break defense system, but it is much slower. Where the last few games focused on speed, this one focuses on weight. Arno doesn't immediately swing his sword the second the button is pressed. There is a delay, almost as if the button is acting as the brain, sending signals to the body to perform the move. The human shields have been completely removed, either to your distaste or pleasure. This means rolling is your best option to avoid them. There are no ship battles, den defense, or other set pieces for alternate combat. All of it is done on your feet with your weapon. And speaking of weapons, there are a shit ton, more than any other game so far. There is a long list of swords, spears, axes, handguns, and rifles, and, after the Dead Kings DLC, a guillotine gun. Armor is abundant as well, and you can mix and match your outfit pieces to upgrade your abilities, but it isn't just health that is affected. Outfits now have an impact on stealth, attack, health, and range of your gun. The same can be said for each weapon. Unlike in previous games, these stats truly affect gameplay, and you can feel it right away when you switch between them. There are far more guard types, and just like in AC3, if you use the wrong strategy on one of them, they will make you pay for it. A lot. Unity introduces a type of skill tree that lets you upgrade your health, master your weapons, and gain a few special moves. No game in the franchise makes you feel quite like Unity did. If realism is what you want from your Assassin's Creed game, then look no further. The weapons feel properly weighted. Arno is a mere mortal and is subject to heavy damage from stronger opponents. Engaging with too many guards in one go is a certain death wish, and the finishers look amazing. The combat was much slower, and while many fans hate that, it definitely had its benefits. We had to stay focused longer. Every move mattered. Every input mattered. Our mistakes were punished more than ever, but our successes were rewarded. A completely new animation system, massive amounts of weapon types, and new weapon types at that. The upgraded system and the pure change in focus makes this nearly as innovative as Assassin's Creed 1 in my mind. They basically created a new combat system. But difficulty, though, is Assassin's Creed Unity's calling card. No instant kill, no human shield, no lightning quick physic defying speed. We were just Arno and his sword. One man versus an army is sure to face death. And I died in Unity more than I died in any other Assassin's Creed game, and I'm sure I'm not alone. This was the first game where actual survival was on my mind the entire game, and that was honestly a refreshing thought. It gives me a reason to use stealth, to stay undetected, as I legitimately might die if I don't. The increased difficulty actually made an Assassin's Creed game feel assassin-y for the first time since Assassin's Creed 1. Arno is not a trained assassin, and his struggle to fight off large amounts of guards reflects that. He doesn't become the mentor that Ezio was. He doesn't have all the years of training of Connor, or the years of practice of Edward. He is learning all of this, just as the player is, and we can connect with him through the combat. By the end of the game, we are quite competent, but that comes from consistently getting better and upgrading our weapons. The French Revolution was a deadly time, so fearing death at every encounter fits the time period nicely. I really wanted to give this the top spot. I really did. The only issue for me was the lack of any alternative forms of combat, such as naval or set pieces, and the many bugs that some people still experience when playing it. If Ubisoft would have stuck with this style, then whatever would have followed would have no doubt topped the list. But for now, we just have to dream. Which leaves, and you guessed it, Assassin's Creed 3 is the best and my favorite combat system in the Assassin's Creed franchise. It changed up a lot, and to many fans, these changes were unwelcome. But in some aspects, I believe that it excelled. One of these aspects is, of course, the combat. It simplified it, allowing for one-button commands. It brought in new weapons, a rope dart, a user-aimed projectile attack in the bow and arrow, and of course, the tomahawk. The Frontier provided us a hunting mechanic, which, yes, is a form of combat, and not just prey, as the predators would attack us. It was a reflective quick-time event that became fairly predictable as the game went on. Still, it made us feel like we were in the wild. Guard types were more distinguishable, but had their own weaknesses. Just like the animals, once you figure this out, it becomes easier, but input incorrectly, and they will make you pay for it. Guns had more use in combat, including bayonets, which could be grabbed in any enemy camp or looted from a fallen soldier, and the finishers were absolutely brutal. The health system of the Ezio trilogy had been scrapped, and back was the synchronization system from the first game. While it means you will always enter combat with full health, there was no safety net when you had low health. A huge inclusion in this game was the ship combat. Not only would this become a major feature in later games, it was an entirely new way to take down enemies with both broadside cannons and swivel guns, giving you a strong and a precise attack. Ramming is also an option if you choose. Aesthetically, AC3 was leaps and bounds beyond its predecessor. The animations were brutal, heavy, and fit Connor's personality to a T. The double kills and human shield made us feel like berserkers on a warpath. We could feel Connor's aggression while fighting, and this was quite different than Haytham, who felt more akin to Ezio, and none of them felt quite like Desmond. The game removed enemy health bars, which seems a bit odd, but this also adds to the aesthetic, as the only way to kill a guard was to use a finishing move at the end of a combo animation. While it does mean you have to reset if it gets interrupted, it made the actual kill all the more satisfying. Assassin's Creed 3's emphasis on the aesthetics of combat cannot be overlooked. The difficulty of Assassin's Creed 3 is once again a tricky one to nail down. On the one hand, the AI is smarter and will make you pay for a wrong move. The lack of a medicine vial removes the emergency plan the Ezio games had. We no longer have armor sets, so there is no option to purposefully make the game harder, but the amount of guards stationed around the cities does create a high level of difficulty, as many fights turn into total bloodbaths with new guards emerging from nearby posts. I honestly don't think many of the Assassin's Creed games incorporated the setting better into their combat system than in Assassin's Creed 3. The weapon types were all incredibly time and character specific. The rope dart, the bow and arrow, the tomahawk were all weapons that really only made sense for Connor to use, and the action fits the personality of the character perfectly. While Connor is quickly a great warrior much like Ezio in AC2, it is explained far better considering he spent years training under Achilles' tutelage. The tutorial section is quite long, but this mainly comes because of the pace of the story, not in spite of it. The variety of weapons, the naval combat, Connor's total brutality, the seamless string of terror we can inflict on the guards, and how all of it connects to the setting and the story perfectly. The only thing keeping this game from a perfect score was that Connor was sometimes too damn strong for his own good. Once you mastered the system, it was too easy, not quite on the Black Flag level, but still quite easy enough. But maybe, that's what made it so great in the first place.
I am the victor. My heart soars. Thank you.
So there you have it, my ranking of the combat in the Assassin's Creed franchise. What's yours? If you liked this video, then like the video. If you want to see more rankings like this, then hit subscribe. But tell me, what would you like to see ranked next? Until then, bye Yaks.